Welcome to today's lesson on populations. This is going to cover two sections of our textbook in Miller and Levine. It's also going to cover really two learning targets for us. We should be able to define the word by now, but today I want to talk about how we describe populations as a scientist. When we describe populations, we want to include several things about that population. One is geographic range, the density of a population, or how many individuals there are in that population, the distribution, or how they are spaced out amongst that geographic range, their growth rate, and then their age structure. All of those 5 things are very important to describing a population within its habitat. So the first one, geographic range, is talking about just the geographic area in which that population is located. This range can vary enormously in size depending on the species. So if we look at this species of plant called hydrilla, which was introduced down here in the southern tip of Florida in the 1950s, it has basically overtaken all of Florida. And that seems like a fairly large geographic range, but if you think about species such as the white-tailed deer, which inhabits just about all of North America, that geographic range is much larger than that of the hydrilla. So when we talk about a population, we want to talk about its geographic range and where that area in which it inhabits, that species inhabits, stops. We also want to talk about population density and the distribution of that population. So density just refers to the number of individuals within a certain area. And populations of different species may have different densities even if they're in the same environment. So if you take this pond example that I have right here, within one pond, the population of ducks may be very low, and it may have a very low density. There may only be a few ducks, while the fish and other animals in the same pond community may have very high densities. It just depends on the number of resources available for each individual species. At the same time, we also want to talk about a population's distribution. And there's basically 3 different types of distribution that you can have. The first one is random. And this is our random distribution, and you can see that our individuals in this picture are just kind of thrown in that particular area. There's no rhyme or reason for where they are at, and we call this a random distribution. This second picture shows a uniform distribution in which it almost looks as if individuals have been planted in a certain space, and many times that's where we see a perfectly uniform distribution. But there are times in nature where we see a more uniform distribution based on, maybe these are trees that need a certain amount of space, a certain amount of sunlight, a certain amount of water, a certain amount of nutrients, and so they may be spaced out fairly evenly, fairly uniformly throughout the area. And our last one is called clumped distribution. And in clump distribution, we kind of have pods of individuals all living together. So you could think of this as, maybe a family of rabbits or a family of wolves that live all together. And they're going to have a clumped distribution. They're not going to space out unless something makes them separate from one another. So when we talk about population, we want to talk about its density and its distribution across the habitat. We also want to talk about a population's growth rate. Population size can increase and decrease or even stay the same. So for the hydrilla, their populations in their native habitat tend to stay more or less the same over time. There will be small periods of growth and there will be small periods of decrease, but over time we see basically it's staying at the same level, and so that growth rate is going to stay around 0 when we're not having an increase nor a decrease. But in Florida, where there's no natural predators of the hydrilla, they have a very high growth rate. This is going to be a positive growth rate. Since there's nothing eating the hydrilla, it can continue to increase in size more and more and more until it takes over an entire area. Populations can also decrease in size. We have decreased the cod, the Atlantic cod population, and so because we've taken over part of its habitat and we'd like to eat cod and fish for cod, cod population has a negative growth rate. So here our population size is staying the same. So same is going to have a 0 growth rate, and increasing is going to have a positive growth rate, and decreasing is going to have a negative growth rate. Finally, we have age structure. When we talk about a population, we want to talk about how many males and how many females of each age a population contains. And the reason that we do that many times is because not only in animals but also in plants, species can only reproduce once they reach a certain age, once they reach a certain maturity. Certainly that is true with humans, and so humans cannot reproduce until they reach puberty. Sometimes in plants you don't have male plants and female plants. Sometimes they have both sex organs, but many times the females will be the only ones that can produce offspring. So if you have too many males in the group of a certain age and not enough females that are ready to reproduce, that may affect the growth rate of a population. So whenever we are describing a population in science, we try and talk about the age structure within that population. Population growth is going to be based off of 4 things. And really you can almost think of them as 2. It's going to be birth rate versus the death rate. If we have more babies being born than we have animals dying, then that population is going to increase in size. If we have more deaths in a certain population than we do births, then that population will decrease. The same is true with immigration rate, and we have to make sure that we know immigration compared to emigration. Immigration are individuals of that species coming into the population. Emigration are those individuals moving out of the population. So if immigration is larger than emigration, you're going to have a population increase. We have 2 different types of growth, exponential growth and logistic growth. With exponential growth, the larger the population gets, the faster it's going to grow. And so if we look at this bacteria, we start off with 1, and the larger that population gets, the quicker that population increases in size. And if we were to continue this graph on an upward trend, it almost goes straight up. And this J curve is indicative of exponential growth. And usually we see this early on in a population's lifespan. But we have to have perfect conditions for this to happen. What I mean by perfect conditions is we have to have more than enough resources for individuals to survive and reproduce. We have to have enough food, we have to have enough space, we have to have enough of all of the resources that species needs. Most of the time, though, we see something called logistic growth. And so in the real world, a lot of times at the beginning of logistic growth, we will see a phase 1 where we have some exponential growth, where as our population is continually getting bigger and bigger. And eventually, as we start to compete for some of those resources, our growth rate is going to stop or slow down. And we're going to continue competing as we get closer and closer to this dotted purple line, and eventually our growth rate is going to become 0. So here we have a very high growth rate, positive growth rate. Here our growth rate is still positive. I'll put a couple of pluses here. Here it's still positive, but it's slowing down. And here we have our growth rate equaling approximately 0. This means that the population size is stabilized, and this usually happens at a place called the carrying capacity. This S-shaped curve is called sigmoidal curve, or S-curve, and this signifies logistic growth. And logistic growth is going to have a population's growth slow, then stop following a period of exponential growth. So what is carrying capacity? Carrying capacity is going to be the maximum number of individuals that a particular species that a particular environment can support. Basically meaning, based on the number of resources, we only have enough resources for this many individuals to survive and reproduce. Anything over this, there's going to be too much competition, and we're going to have a dip in the population. So we go a little bit above it and we have a dip in the population, but overall we stay right about this carrying capacity unless there's a major shift within that habitat. There are going to be some limiting factors that affect that carrying capacity. Some of them are density dependent, meaning it's going to depend on the number of organisms within the area. If that number is really large, then competition becomes greater. That is the density dependent limiting factor. Disease is going to be more easily spread because there are more individuals coming in contact with one another. Individuals are going to become more stressed because of the overcrowding. So all of those are going to depend on the number of organisms that are in that area. We've talked a lot about competition and how if the whole class is fighting over one candy bar rather than two people fighting over the same candy bar, there's more competition. We've talked a lot about predation and herbivory. If there's plenty of prey to eat, then there can be more predators. If there's too many predators, then the prey population is going to decrease, and so it's going to affect that prey's population, and in turn the prey's population is going to affect the predator's population. Same with herbivory. And we've seen this in predator-prey relationships, and they've mapped it out on an island called Isle Royale in Lake Superior, and they've tracked moose and wolf populations. So we can see as the moose population increases, then the wolf population increases. And as the wolf increases, then the moose decreases. So when wolves have plenty to eat, their population grows. This graph also shows a dramatic drop in the wolf population when there is a CPV outbreak. CPV is a virus that was accidentally introduced to the island and killed all but 13 wolves. And so their populations decreased drastically in a short amount of time. So disease is going to be one of those density dependent limiting factors within a population. There are also density independent limiting factors. Things that we can't control, such as hurricanes and droughts, floods. Those things we cannot control, and it doesn't matter how big the population is or what its distribution is. Those things are going to happen no matter what, and they can affect the size of the population. If we have a wildfire, that is drastically going to decrease the number of trees within that habitat. So that ends my talk today. Make sure that you take a look at the book, read a little bit in the book. Remember that this video does not exclude you from that material. We'll see everybody in class. Have a good day.